when we have come out of this period where all of America's allies have expressed so much uncertainty about the role the United States should play in the world, the sustainability of the alliances, all of these things, how is it possible that we have the French President Macron saying, yep, America's back. Yep, that's right. How's that possible?
Well, in part because they want America to be back and wish is their command. They want a United States that's engaged. They want a United States that cares, even loves Europe, that thinks that Europe is important. They want a United States that's there to be on the global stage to enhance themselves. They want a United States that figures out how to deal with some of the big challenges that they themselves are unwilling or unable to deal with. So in that sense, they're just happy in that America is back. But America's also back. I mean, it's a reality. It's not just about what they want. In a very important sense, that this president returns the United States to the kind of engagement that used to be the norm and was the norm for a very long period of time, no matter how many disagreements one might have had between George W. Bush and a Clinton or Obama administrations. And by the way, there were a lot of disagreements. The fact that the United States had an indispensable role, a leading role in the world was never questioned until Donald Trump was president. And Biden comes from a generation, comes from a sense and an engagement sense that says, no, that's the role we need to take. Now, the real question, right, is how long is that United States going to be back rather than a Trumpian United States? And I think the other question is the kind of way the United States has engaged the world still the appropriate way for dealing with the challenge we have? But back, yeah, for sure.
And I mean, we'll get to both of those things. But I mean, if you want to ask how much of this is about Biden being president, someone that they know, they're comfortable with, he's a multilateral in orientation, he likes diplomacy, I mean, his team is oriented that way, and how much of this is the Russians increasingly antagonizing under Putin a lot of American allies? How much of this is the Chinese increasingly antagonizing a lot of the allies and a reaction? I mean, if you had to balance those things, how would you score it?
Well, it's not an either or. It's an and, right? It is from a geopolitical, a realism, a foreign policy perspective. The national interest of the countries in Europe is being threatened directly by what Russia is doing, directly in terms of military force and the capabilities they have acquired over the last decade plus, the willingness to use that force, threatened by cyber intrusions, threatened by disruptive behavior with regard to our electoral systems, on gas, on so many other ways, and of course, threatened by the Chinese, threatened ideologically, threatened politically, threatened economically, and indeed increasingly threatened militarily. The Chinese are in Europe. China may not be in Europe, but the Chinese are. Through the Belt and Road Initiative, through a whole variety of ways in which they have economic and political linkages created to NATO members, including members like Italy and Greece.
And they've been welcomed. The Chinese have been welcomed by those European members.
Exactly. So they're very much part of this. And there is an interest to say, okay, we want to engage with them, but we also want to make sure that our own interests are protected. And we need the United States for that purpose. We need a counterbalance. We need a balance of power that, in fact, favors us over those two challenges that they face. And they can't do it by themselves, no matter how much they want to talk about European sovereignty or strategic autonomy. The reality is the United States, if it's willing to be part of it, should be part of that equation. And they want the United States. And at the same time, Biden is the most Atlanticist president since at least George H.W. Bush. Tony Blinken is the most Atlanticist Secretary of State.
Explain for our audience, since that's a super wonky term, when you say Atlanticist, concretely, what does that mean for you?
So it means that in the core of your thinking about the way America engages, looking across the Atlantic and looking towards partnerships with Europeans is kind of your first natural instinct. A problem arises, and who do you call? Are you going to call your friends in Latin America, or in Africa, or in the Middle East, or even in Asia, or are you going to call your friends in Europe? And the Atlanticist instinct, this instinct to think about how the United States and Europe together, the we, in some ways, is now in the Oval Office and back on the 7th floor in Foggy Bottom.
Certainly agree with you on Secretary of State Blinken. Let me push back at least a little bit when we talk about Biden. I mean, first invitation to the White House, Japanese Prime Minister Suga. Second invitation, South Korean President Moon. I mean, the Quad, something they're trying to stand up. China seen as the top priority, not Russia. I mean, how much do you really want to lean into that?
So it is where I think Biden and Blinken, by the way, and Sullivan and everyone else, the team is understanding that it's no longer enough to be Atlanticist. You can't do your entire foreign policy engagement only with Europe. What you really need is you need a North American, Asian, European, advanced democratic alignment. So you want to bring in your Asian allies, you want to bring in your European allies, and of course the Canadians and the United States in order to solve these issues. You kind of want to enlarge the G7, right? It was the right thing to do for Biden is to reach out to our Asian partners, to bring Suga and Moon to the White House, as you said, for Austin, the Secretary of Defense, and the Secretary of State Blinken to make their first trip to Japan and Korea, and to have this meeting of the Quad, India, Australia, Japan, and the United States, at the first level, at a leader level, to have that kind of cooperation. But it's not an alternative to Europe. This president is not pivoting away from Europe. It's trying to align both our European partnerships and our Asian partnerships to deal with the challenges we face: China, cyber, climate, COVID, to take 4 C's as the key thing.
How do you think you avoid ending up in a Cold War with the Chinese, given this level of momentum that is being driven by Biden, but frankly, in a bipartisan way in the United States?
Yeah, and I think it's a real challenge because the United States doesn't do foreign policy subtly. We're not particularly good at that, even though I think Biden's understanding and Blinken's understanding of the challenge that China poses is not in Cold War terms. It's not an either or in many ways. There is a severe need to compete, but you compete by doing more ourselves, by working together on the strengths that we have, which are partners and allies around the world. We've got 55 allies to the United States, and China has 1, North Korea. Good luck trying to compete effectively if we can bring those 55 allies along in the competition. But it's not about confrontation. It's not about conflict. It's not a zero-sum game. You need to find ways to cooperate with the Chinese. You heard Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who's made a strong stance against China, say in Brussels this week, no one around this table wants a Cold War. I think that's true for Joe Biden as well.
And you mentioned early on that there is a big unknown on the part of allies as to what extent the United States' commitment to these things is sustainable. I mean, it flagged under the Trump administration, but it also flags inside Congress. How much of a constraint is that?
So, I mean, first of all, when it comes to NATO, right, as an institution, both public and congressional support remains extremely high. Yeah. Even during the Trump years, overwhelming majorities and unanimity in almost all cases, except I think 1, voted to say that the U.S. Membership of NATO was in the fundamental security interests of the United States. So it's there, but it's flailing, right? It's changing, and the nature is changing. This is the big bet, and I think Biden has kind of understood this. We have to demonstrate that a continuing global engagement by the United States and working together with other democracies can demonstrate to our own people that that delivers in a way that the alternatives don't, that delivers for them. That's why I think the kind of economic policies that the Biden administration are putting forward, not in their specific, but in its overarching sense, that coordinating on the economic recovery, which they agreed in the G7 to continue to do, including fiscal expansionism as part of that, and monetary expansionism as part of that. That a new tax regime that lays a minimum level of corporate taxation globally is all necessary so you can start providing for the folks back home to understand that cooperation with our friends and allies around the world, our democratic friends and allies around the world, has real tangible benefit for the average American. I think it's worth trying to make it happen, because the alternative, I think, is exactly as you say. It's to say, wait a minute, this costs too much. Why are we doing this? Why don't we turn our backs to the world? We can worry about what people, we need to worry about what people at home are doing, not what people abroad are doing. That kind of change will continue. But we need that kind of investment in this kind of idea of how cooperation among democracies delivers for the people who live in democracies much better than autocracies can. In a normal conversation with the average folks here in Chicago and in the Midwest, most of them get it. Most of them understand that you can't defend yourselves by building higher walls and closing all the gates and having more guns at your border, because what's happening economically, what's happening in terms of health and climate, in terms of migration patterns that come with it, means that if the problems over there aren't addressed, they're inevitably going to come over here. In some ways, the pandemic has helped. In an unfortunate way, it's like oxygen. You don't know how much you miss it until it's no longer there, right? And so the pandemic and the fact that we are related to the rest of the world brought home to people that we need to be engaged to deal with the problems that are abroad in order to defend ourselves at home. We've just seen this, I think, with vaccines. Yes, it was very important for Americans to get the vaccines that are being produced here as quickly as possible. But increasingly, people are understanding that vaccinating the rest of the world is important, so no new variants will emerge that can defeat the vaccines that we're relying on to go back to our normal life. So we need to vaccinate the rest of the world.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting that for all of the politicization of things like U.S. dues to the United Nations and support for NATO, there was no pushback from either side of the political spectrum in the U.S. when Biden announced that 500 million vaccines were going to be donated to poor countries around the world. And that clearly is a reason for optimism.
Yeah, no, I think so. And the Chicago Council of Global Affairs, we've been doing opinion polling for almost 50 years to ask Americans what they think about America's role in the world. And that polling has consistently demonstrated that on the question of whether the United States should play an active role in world affairs or stay out of world affairs, 2/3 of Americans think we should play an active role. Now, you can then define what that active role means, and we've tried to do that. But in almost every way, Americans understand that being involved in the world is no longer just a luxury. It's something we have to do for our own national interest. And that's how you got to sell this. That's why a foreign policy for the middle class is actually a pretty good slogan when you think about it, because it's trying to sell engagement, being part of the world, solving problems together with your friends and partners around the world as a means to helping you achieve what you want every day, which is to have a good job that pays enough.
I have not asked you much about Russia, mostly because the G7 and NATO are much more important, and China, than what we're talking about with Russia, and it gets way too much airtime. But briefly, how surprised have you been that the Biden administration has been focusing so much on predictability and finding areas where the Americans and Russians might be able to work together?
In some ways, of course, it is very surprising that you've seen this outreach, because Biden, in some ways, was the most skeptical president about both Russia and Vladimir Putin of any post-Cold War president, from Bill Clinton onwards, to come to office. But on the other side, it's not that. It's understandable. Part of being back is understanding that you need to deal with security threats, not just through bigger budgets on the military side and more deterrence, but also dialogue, and where possible, arms control and cooperation on the kinds of issues that could really, really change the world very, very quickly. And the arms control framework that was built up from President Johnson and Nixon onwards is unraveling. It's been starting to unravel for quite a while, but Trump really pulled all the threads in one go, with treaty after treaty walking away. So the first thing he does, and I think rightly so, it says, let's take the New START agreement and extend that for 5 years. And now let's spend some time seeing, is there a way to build predictability and stability in this relationship? Nuclear weapons still exist, and no one wants to have a war in which those weapons would ever be used.
Ivo Daalder, he runs the Chicago Council, and I'm delighted to have him on the show. Thanks so much.
Hey, Ian, it's great to talk to you as ever. Thanks.